That's good. So I bet everybody's seen this map before. It's usually in the back of your Bible. I remember sitting during services and once in a while looking back there and wondering about it, and you'll find a map of Israel in the back, what it was like during the time of I'm just realizing a bunch of people are here that I know. That's good to see you. But you look in the back of the Bible and you see it's very familiar to you, and there's a lot of events that are recorded in the New Testament that took place in this part of the world. In the north part, I'm sure you probably spent some time kind of looking it over, and you'll see the Sea of Galilee. And a lot of what we read about Jesus took place around the Sea of Galilee. This whole area was where he spent a lot of his time. A lot of his friends, a lot of people that he knew, their job was to fish this particular area. In 1986, I just found this out recently, there was this drought in Galilee, and the water level went way down. And there's fishermen that are still there today, and some fishermen saw something sticking out of the mud, and they started kind of looking through the mud to see what it was, and it was very fragile. And when they touched it, it was like wet cardboard. They would touch it, it would crumble under their touch. And so they contacted nautical archaeologists. I've never said that before. Nautical archaeologists. I didn't even know that was such a thing. And they contacted those guys from all over the world, and they examined it. It was obviously very old. It was a very old boat. And the challenge was they had to come up with a way to come up, get the boat out of the mud, to get it out without destroying it. So they put a lot of thought and planning into it, a lot of planning, and they dug underneath it, covered it with foam that hardened into something that was kind of like styrofoam, and they encased the whole thing in this stuff, and then carefully lifted it out. And just this part of the excavation took about 12 days, so almost 2 weeks of just to get it out of the mud. And they took it to a safe location and began the restoration process. So it's kind of interesting. They put it in this big tank full of chemicals, and these chemicals would take away all the styrofoam stuff that they had used to transport it. At the same time, the chemicals drew the water out of the wood, and while that was happening, they would inject wax material to support the structure. And it was a very slow process. It took 7 years to finally get this relic up to where people could see it. 7 years of this process of extracting the water and injecting it with this wax so it would hold together. And then they built a museum for it. You can go out there, I guess, and go see it. It's in the Middle East because they confirmed that it is a vessel, a boat from the 1st century. They even call it the Jesus boat, if you want to look it up for yourself. Now, everyone involved realizes that more than likely it's not the same boat that Jesus used, but it was the same kind of boat. It's a typical fishing boat from that time. And as I was finding out more out about this, I was very impressed with the amount of attention and care, amazing levels of caution and patience, almost love, to preserve this artifact and make sure that they could bring it to the surface and then preserve it as best they could. So one thing that stands out to me were the dimensions of it. It ended up being 7.5 feet by 27 feet. And I asked, there's a lot of guys here who know about building stuff, so I asked them before we came out here this morning. So it's about maybe 3 or 4 pews wide going this way, and about from the beginning of that pew to the end of that pew. That's how big the boat is, about 27 by 7.5 feet. And when you keep these dimensions in mind, and when you see what they were able to restore, and then you read about the storm in Matthew 8, you begin to appreciate the fear of the men who were in the boat. So with this restored boat in mind, let's read what happened. Here's another diagram, by the way, of kind of give you dimensions at the bottom there as far as comparison. Kind of gives you about a pretty good idea of what size we're talking about. So you can appreciate maybe their fear a little bit better when you realize the exact dimensions that are involved. We're going to read Matthew 8, starting at verse 23. So Jesus and his apostles are going across Galilee, and this is what happens. Matthew 8, Jesus and his apostles are in this boat. When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep, and they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The men were amazed and said, "What kind of a man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Now, two of the other Gospels give us additional details, so I'll show you a couple of those. Mark 4:35 says, "On that day when evening came, he said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.'" And this includes a detail that I think I've often either overlooked or forgotten. Notice it says, "when evening came." So not only are they dealing with a storm, but it's night. Night is falling. That always kind of makes it a little more difficult. Night is falling and it's getting darker. Jesus and the apostles were sailing east across the Galilee. From what we know of the account, that's what's going on. And it was nighttime. There are additional details, and it kind of helps to emphasize the seriousness of the storm. Here's Mark 4:36. Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. I always thought that was an interesting detail. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. And then Luke 8:23 includes this. But as they were sailing along, he fell asleep, and a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. Now, the 7.5 by 27 foot dimensions, that comes to mind. It's a very small boat and a very big storm. If you kind of picture 12 or so, 13 people in that much space. So you put all these passages together. It says, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. There arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. And a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. So I guess, because the Sea of Galilee is still there, you probably knew that. And every day on the Sea of Galilee, it's kind of a standard procedure with the weather there. The environment's pretty consistent, pretty predictable. At the first part of the day, if you were to go there in the morning, the water's typically calm, almost like glass, very smooth. But then as the day progresses, every day on the Sea of Galilee, this is what happens. About 3 o'clock, a breeze comes from the Mediterranean Sea. So it's blowing from the west. It comes across the Jezreel Valley, and it comes towards the Galilee. This happens about every day, about 3 o'clock. And the breeze starts to pick up as wind travels across more distance. It can tend to pick up speed, especially depending on the landscape, the terrain. So by evening, it's just part of life. When you're dealing with the Sea of Galilee, it gets choppy. The waves start kind of picking up. And that happens almost every day. Virtually every evening, this happens. And so this particular kind of wind is expected. This would be something that these men would be familiar with, at least the ones who are fishermen that are in this boat. But once in a while, something different happens. So this is what's happening on a typical day as the wind is blowing from the west. But once in a while, something different will happen. Instead of from the west, the wind comes from the east, and this is a hot wind from the desert. That's a desert area over to the east. And the distance the wind travels and the effect of the terrain, it speeds up the wind, and it crosses a greater distance. It's a much faster wind, and the wind is moving very fast, and that, of course, affects the size of the waves. And this hot wind comes out of the desert, hits the mountain, and goes down into the lake, about a 700-foot drop below sea level. And when this wind hits the water, it starts making really big waves. I guess today there are even hotels on the southwest side of the Galilee. They have a boardwalk and things like that are built right up against the water. And it's been often reported where there will be waves that reach the second floor of these hotels, over 10 feet high, which might not seem that big, 10 feet. But when you remember that you're in a 7.5 by 27 foot boat, these are big waves. Mark 4:38, it says, Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And then Luke 8:24, they came to Jesus and woke him up, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And the reaction of the apostles should give us a pretty good idea of what was going on, how serious this was. These are professional fishermen. They've been on a boat before. They've seen storms before. This is probably not one of those winds coming at 3 o'clock from the west. They're on this lake every day. They probably spent most of their lives fishing on this lake. They've seen storms before. If they say the boat's going down, the boat's going down. All three accounts have this phrase, we are dead, we're perishing, this is it. They knew what they were talking about. This was a dire situation. So they're not overreacting. Mark 4:39 says, And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush. In other words, be quiet. Be still. And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And then Luke 8:24 says, And he got up and rebuked the wind and the surging waves, and they stopped, and it became calm. Both Matthew and Mark's account describe it as perfectly calm, kind of like what it is during the day earlier, where it's like glass. I guess you could say, maybe I should take it back. I said they didn't overreact, but from Jesus' perspective, I guess they are overreacting because they don't realize who's in the boat. This is the same voice that said, let there be light. So for him to get up and say, hush, be still, is not any less powerful. Jesus spoke to the weather, and it didn't get less stormy. It became perfectly calm. And then at that point, Jesus asked a question. The answer to this question might be pretty helpful to us. And here's Jesus' question. Where is your faith? And that's a really interesting question to consider. I think the answer that day, their faith was in the boat. Their faith was 7.5 by 27 feet long. That's what they were used to. I don't think their faith was in Jesus. They thought the circumstances, here's the dimensions of our faith, here's the storm, we're going down. Their faith wasn't in Jesus, not yet, not fully. It was in their efforts. It was in their physical circumstances. Many times what we call faith in God is actually kind of like their faith in the boat. You know, if our bank accounts are happy, you know, if the car's running, if everybody's well, and our faith is doing pretty good, and that's the dimensions of our faith. And all of that does pretty good up until a big storm comes. And the storm that often does come reveals the truth that ultimately we have faith in ourselves. The apostles' peace of mind that day was determined by the boat. Their faith in Jesus was like that boat. It was small and very susceptible to storms. The dimensions of their faith, it was limited. And of course, a little bit of real faith is incredibly powerful, but small faith doesn't float for very long. In fact, later, Matthew 17, later when the apostles asked Jesus why their efforts to be like him kept kind of falling short, I thought it was worth pointing out what he said. He said, because of the littleness of your faith, for I truly say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you, or to you. But notice he says, well, it's because of the littleness of your faith. It's too small. He goes on to say, there's mustard seed size, and that I can work with that. But then there's really small faith. And these fishermen in the boat, they had been in charge of a very small part of the universe for a long time. And it's frightening when you realize that you're not even really in charge of that. They've been used to saying, lift this sail, turn the boat this way, and they were in control. It's a startling thing to realize when you are not the one in control. And it's important that our faith isn't like this 7.5 by 27 foot boat. But I would say I was looking at this and I got to thinking, I think in many cases it's actually worse than that. Our faith can end up being like a 7.5 by 27 foot boat in a museum. Those people, that I read about, those nautical archaeologists and all the people involved with the restoration process who restored the boat, they approached it with care and patience, and I would even say their own idea of reverence. And they put it in a place of honor. And it's impressive. And it is treated with honor. And it is protected and cared for. But it is still very, very fragile. And I wonder if our faith can be reduced to that, in essence, going to church. It's probably a lot like that boat in the museum. It's impressive. I mean, we're not like a lot of people, who don't go to church. And we treat this with honor, and we protect it and care for it, but it's still very, very fragile. It would be one thing to face a storm with a solid boat, but to sail out into life with this, all I can say is good luck. If that's what we have, I guess it has the semblance and shape of Christianity. But when the boat started to go down, Jesus spoke to the weather and canceled the storm. Jesus had spoken to the people with authority, and he spoke to nature with authority. The big difference is that nature obeys without question. But I think it's very significant to notice how this account ends. The boat and the men in it, everything's calm now, and the men in the boat are stunned. There's no record of them saying, that was a close one, I'm so happy it's over. They were afraid before, but now that the storm is over, their fear has increased for different reasons. Mark 4:41, it says they became very much afraid. And then they have a question that comes to their mind, who is this? They were in charge of the boat, at least that's what they thought, but Jesus is in charge of the universe. So I think one thing, at least for me, to take away from this is they had a faith problem, and I think we all do. It's important to make sure that we're not in the same boat, so to speak, and our faith can't be a small boat in a museum, something we visit once in a while and we honor it and say, yes, we have this Christian-shaped thing. It can't be an honorable relic that we dig up and honor without really using. It's got to be useful to us. You can't float around in what is kept in a museum. We dig it up once in a while and honor it without really being in it. Our Christianity wasn't meant to be in a museum. That kind of belief is extremely susceptible to waves. James 1:6 even says, the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Our faith is often like that. And I bet I was putting this together and I actually thought of somebody else that wasn't in the boat. It's another guy. I don't even know his name. He's in Mark 9. But I think we can all identify with him, this one man in particular. His name is not recorded, but he's mentioned in Mark 9. And his son was sick. His son was pretty bad off, and he asked Jesus to heal his son. And Jesus, is talking to this guy, and Jesus tells him, he says, all things are possible to him who believes. This could work. But the father knows something's missing. He knows his belief is not what it should be. And this is what he says in verse 24. He says, I do believe, help my unbelief. He's basically saying, I'm really trying. I want to do better. I know I'm not where I need to be. I want to do better. And I bet we're like that. We want to do better. We have something, and maybe it's floating pretty good, but I don't want my faith to be like this ancient boat in a museum that crumbles if you touch it. I want my faith to be bigger than it was yesterday. I want it to be more solid. And so the good news is that we can have a better faith. We can't if we just break even, if we just kind of fall into a routine of our religious routines, of just going to church. But the good news is that we can have a better faith, and it can be stronger every day. Romans 10:17 says faith comes from the Word. That means that the Word has the materials you need to build a stronger faith. Whenever I read about the storm that terrified these fishermen, I think I'm going to try and remember that the storm is bigger than me, but my God is bigger than the storm. And that's what they didn't know yet that day. And ultimately, when we're dealing with this analogy, if our lives are like being in this boat and sometimes facing the storm doesn't matter. The dimensions of the boat, not really, that doesn't even matter. You know what matters is whether or not Jesus is in the boat with you. Even if he's asleep, you're better off than being on your own. And that's really the bottom line. It's kind of obvious. If you are currently trying to cross this life without Jesus in the boat, I guess that's the first thing I'd highly recommend, because the storms are coming, and even without the storms, you will not last long. This life will be overwhelming to you without Jesus. If you have not made that decision, I would really encourage you to do that as soon as possible. But if Jesus is in the boat, if you are a Christian, you and I have nothing to worry about. That was the message that they did not quite have in mind that day. The storm was kind of scary, but because Jesus was with them, they didn't have anything to worry about. And if we grow our faith in him by being in his word, the trip's going to be a lot easier and very peaceful. I hope this helps you while we stand together and sing.